afternoon. Welcome to the Klima Lecture. Here's my first slide. As you can see, the program is not being given at Colorado Springs on June 19th, 2020. Unfortunately, we were unable to hold that meeting, and practically every Rose activity for the year has been canceled. On the top of the bookcase behind me is a collection of milk cartons, juice cans, Slurpee cups, and other containers used for transporting roses to rose shows that didn't get any use this year. But because of the virus, many communities and families have lost valued members, and the rose judging community is no different. We lost David J. Rink in April. He was the New York District Horticultural Judging Chair, and I had the pleasure of working with him on starting with the Syracuse Mini National in 2011 on several national shows, district shows, and local shows, and we'll certainly miss him. Here he is judging Penn Jersey District Show in Lancaster in 2012. There were no low tables available, and all the district challenge classes had to be staged on high tables, or not high tables, on standard height tables. And the judges had to stand on chairs to see the roses. And I use this slide to point out to people that you can't move a challenge class. You've got to be able to judge it somehow without moving it. All right. It was suggested that because I received this award for education in rose judging, I say something about rose judging. So thought I'd try and see what the history of rose judging was, and I figured that probably I should look for the beginning of competitive rose shows, because obviously if there was a competition, there must have been some judges and some judging. And there are online several newspaper databases that go back into the 1700s, and they have been scanned in their full searchable full word. And so I was able to search back and find various articles and about rose shows, or rose exhibitions as they were generally known as. But here we see in 1834, the Aberdeen Horticultural Society is having an exhibition, and they have classes, two classes for roses, one for 12 double roses and one for seedling doubles. But it's a general show. There's one for 3 heads of cauliflower, and there's strawberries. Now this is in July. That would be a little late for strawberries in our area, but maybe in Scotland that's about right. Also irises, but it also said that this is their 4th competition, which would indicate that they started having competitions about 1831. Here's another one. In 1837, you can see there were classes for roses and also geraniums and pinks and various other flowers. The United States was no different. Here, 1838, the Massachusetts Horticultural Society was having an exhibit on the 23rd of June, 1838, which would be about right for New England. And once again, they were showing roses and pinks. And you needed to have your entries in by 10 o'clock in the morning. Now, just to give you an idea, in 1838, Martin Van Buren was president of the United States, and Samuel Findlay Breeze Morse had just demonstrated the telegraph. So that gives you an idea of what the technology was at that time. Note that gentlemen having roses who are not desirous to enter them for prizes are respectively invited to contribute specimens for exhibition. So there was an exhibition as well as a competition. There's no indication what ladies who had roses who wished to enter them should do, but that's probably not unexpected. All right, that brings us to this gentleman, Samuel Reynolds Hull. He was elevated, he was a clergyman, Reverend Samuel Hull, and he was elevated to the Dean of Rochester Cathedral in 1887, so you'll frequently see him referred to as Dean Hull. Well, just remember that Dean is his title, not his name. His name was Samuel Reynolds. He was about 1850. He was invited to judge a rose show in April, and he knew perfectly well that roses did not bloom in in the UK in April, and he thought it was sort of a joke. But the person who had invited him very politely responded and said that these were indoor grown roses, and if he would come, they would tell him all about it. So he went, and it was as if he'd taken the road to Damascus. He suddenly became a devotee of the rose. He was converted to promoting the rose. He said later in life that he had seen a lot of rose shows since then, but he'd never seen one that was better than this working man rose show that he saw in Nottingham in 1850. Interestingly, that when he was invited to judge this show, he said he had a large garden but no roses and didn't know anything about them. And apparently, merely being a clergyman was considered sufficient qualifications to judge a flower show. All right. By 1859, there was a show in London that was strictly for roses. And as the newspaper notes here, that was somewhat of a novelty. Ordinarily, you have all kinds of blooms, but here, this is the idea of holding a show of just roses was due to the Reverend S. Reynolds Hole, who suggested it, and whose proposition has been well and warmly responded by both the amateur and professional florists of the kingdom. So here we have the first big rose show in London in 1859. By 1876, the National Rose Society was organized. Here we go. And they held their first show July 5th, 1877. It was yesterday afternoon in St. James Hall. The National Rose Society held the first of its proposed series of annual shows. Notice about 10,000 entries, not bad, and about 200 pounds in awards were given away in prizes. The success of the show was highly satisfactory, the hall being crowded with visitors throughout the day. Well, the Royal National Rose Society was organized in December 9th, 1876. It was the National Rose Society to begin with, became the Royal National Rose Society in 1965. It was the first plant society. I mean, formerly we had horticultural societies, which were concerned not only with roses, but with other flowers and possibly with fruits and vegetables as well. But this was the first society in the world that was dedicated to a single type of flower. So it's considered to be the first plant society. Unfortunately, it had a problem, financial problems, decrease in membership, and was dissolved in 2017. But one of the first things the National Rose Society did, in addition to having that show, was to ask leading rosarians how they judged roses, what was considered important. And this is what they came up with. Now, it's important to understand that it was not Dean Hole or someone else at the National Rose Society or a committee of the National Rose Society sat down and said, well, how do you think we ought to judge roses? What do you think is important? What they did is they asked the people who were growing roses, showing roses, judging roses, how they judged it, what they considered important. So they looked to see what people were doing and wrote it down. An attorney would refer to this as codification of the common law. Find out what people are doing and write it down. So here we have what the Royal National Society, what the National Rose Society came up with, what the people told them in 1878. Note, a good rose must have form, size, brightness, substance, foliage, and be at the time of judging in the most perfect phase of possible beauty. Now that sounds almost like the current guidelines for judging roses. It hasn't changed that much. Brightness, if you look at the bottom line there, you'll see brightness shall imply freshness of color, brilliancy, and purity. It's exactly what we call as color. So here are 5 of the 6 prime elements of judging had already been spelled out by the people who were working and judging roses by 1878. A bad rose. All blooms shall be considered bad that have faulty shape, confused center, faded color. either undersized or oversized. Form, petals abundant and of good substance, regularly and gracefully dispersed within a circular symmetrical outline. Now we would add and tending to a high center to that, but that's pretty much what we say about his exhibition form. So this is really the seminal document for rose judging. Everything since then has been some elaboration of these particular standards that had been developed and that the National Rose Society put in writing in 1878. Note, for example, that there's no indication what's the relative importance of form, size, brightness, substance, and foliage. Which is more? Is form more important than foliage? Is size better than substance? So they look at these 5 characteristics, but there's no indication how they should be weighted. Well, the British, as you remember, are judging roses in boxes, and each box received a score. And outstanding bloom got 3 points, a good bloom 2 points, a so-so bloom 1 point, and a bad bloom a -1 point. So each box got a number. And if boxes were tied, here's what they were supposed to do. Judges shall proceed to consider the general evenness, variety, arrangement, and setting up. Boxes being placed side by side and in the same light for that purpose. So if things are close, we're going to look at overall appearance. That sound familiar? Sure does. They also had some notes about judges. Judges shall, as far as possible, be 3 in number for small shows and for all sections of large shows, selected principally from successful exhibitors. They shall have no manner of interest in the sections which they are judging. They must be non-partial. And I thought that was interesting they put this in. They shall begin punctually at the hour appointed. They needed to tell the judges to show up on time and get to work. But these are the same, pretty much the same standards we use even today for selecting roses. Well, apparently, after the National Rose Society put out these standards, they were published and circulated. And here we see a notice that was printed in the paper for a show in Savannah, Georgia in 1889. Hang on, sorry, next slide. There we see the notice for a show in Savannah, Georgia in 1889 by the Savannah Floral and Art Exhibition show. And here are exactly what the National Rose Society had put forth, except for the fact that they've Americanized the spelling of color and center, but it's the same thing that they, so apparently these were widely distributed and adopted by other groups that were having shows. Well, that was 3 years before the American Rose Society was founded. The American Rose Society was founded in 1892. And as I'm sure most of you know, it was really originally an organization of florists and commercial rose growers, more than the amateur, quote, where they can all considered to be the amateur rose grower. But they had their first show in 1900. And the date was March 27th through 29th, 1900 in New York City. Now, I haven't checked this with the Manhattan Rose Society, but I suspect that in mid-March, there aren't any roses blooming outside in New York City. There certainly aren't in Delaware, and New York City shouldn't be that much different from Delaware. So this was for greenhouse-grown roses. Interesting thing about this show is there's a list of the prominent ladies who have signified their approval by becoming patronesses. Now, I haven't gone through that list, but I did pick out a few. Mrs. F.W. Vanderbilt, Mrs. Theodore Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt was governor of New York at the time. Mrs. Astor, Mrs. J.P. Morgan, Mrs. James Roosevelt. Mrs. James Roosevelt was the mother of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So they apparently had a lot of sponsorship. So 1907, they had this show in Washington, D.C., once again in March, and they were invited to the White House. Teddy Roosevelt was president at the time, and he invited the American Rose Society to the White House. I don't know that we could get an invitation to the White House today, but they certainly did in 1907. And here's a report of the meeting. There's two questions were then brought forth for discussion. What definitive work can the American Rose Society take up at this time for its members, in particular for the rose-loving public in general, that does not now do? So what should the ARS be doing? Second, granted that a large increased membership is desirable and essential to the permanence and usefulness of the American Rose Society, how may it best be accomplished? Where should we find ready response among the professional florists and gardeners, or what is commonly called amateurs? So, two questions: what should we do? How do we increase the membership? I would imagine that the people who attended this meeting would not have felt out of place at Thursday's board meeting, because these two questions are still questions that the ARS board is struggling with. In 1908, notices began to appear that had a scale of point judging. There was an article that was put together by the florist industry that was widely distributed throughout the country, apparently, because I found it republished in a paper in Ohio and one in Montana. But it said, as a regular scale of points for judging roses has been adopted by the American Rose Society. We'll take a look at this in a moment in more detail, but there it is. At one time, the American Rose Society published a member's handbook. Now, this is not to be confused with the annuals, to which I'm sure most of you are familiar, but there was a separate publication called the Member's Handbook. And I found on the internet a scan PDF that had the 1920 to 1926 Member's Handbook. I was able to purchase the 1949 and 1944 Member's Handbook. Now, this had financial statements, minutes of board meetings, minutes of committee meetings, and also a rather extensive section on the standards that the ARS had developed for judging. In addition, it had a complete list of members along with their addresses. So you can go back and look and see who the members of the ARS were in your community in 1920. So, all right, here's the cover of the 1920 Members Handbook. And here they had the regulations and scale of points for judging blooms. And they had points for groups of rose plants, individual rose plants, single specimens of rose plants. But down here, competitive classes, size 15%, color 20%, stem 20, form 15, substance 15, foliage 15. Novelties, and also a section for novelties, which I think we would call seedlings. So here's the standards. Notice, form is only 15 points. Color is 20. Stem and foliage are two separate elements. Stem's 20, foliage 15, for a total of 35. So stem and foliage are 35% and form's only 15%. And when they were talking stem, as will be apparent, what they were talking about is length of stem. The longer, the better. So you try to get the longest possible stem, because that's how you got the most points. Now, here was the schedule for novelties. Notice that stem's now only 15 points, and there's 10 points for distinctiveness, which we would call, in our seedling score now, we refer to that as originality. There's also 5 points for fragrance, which is sort of interesting. The only place we consider fragrance now is in the fragrance class. Okay, here was another thing. All roses shall be disqualified for exhibited with more than 2 growths, 1 pinch, except for classes calling for displays and for 100 or more blooms in 1 vase, on which 2 pinches are allowed. I'm not quite sure what that means. I think what they're saying is that 1 stem on stem is permissible, but more than 1 is not, unless it's in a display or in something for more than 100 blooms. But all right, here's the Potomac Rose Society in 1938. Here was what was published in the paper. Cut the flower with long stems. The length of stem counts 20% of the final score, and every point helps to win. But then, it is not considered proper to cut beyond the current growth. That is, beyond the point of the emergence of the flowering shoot. This seems to indicate that stem on stem is not considered proper, but it doesn't say it's a disqualification. So I'm not quite sure what they meant by it's not considered proper. Note, here's the standards over here. Now, about 1938, 1940, a new scale of points for judging appeared, and so you'll see now form has become 25%, color 25, substance 20. Stem and foliage have been combined, and they've cut back from 35% to 20%, and size is now 10%. This is very similar to the current one, and we'll talk about the modification shortly about. Okay, 1950, ARS decided to hold a judging school. They held their first judging school in Washington, D.C., September 30th through October 1st through 3rd for the annual meeting. That's dates are right for Washington. And there was a report published later in the Washington Evening Star about the judging school. And as you can imagine, it was a list of prominent Rosarians who talked about the prime elements of judging, just like a judging school today. So, the committee on qualification of judges decided that we needed a manual. It was nice we had these schools, but not everybody could go to schools. And anyway, the judges needed some kind of reference that they could carry around with them. So they decided to publish a manual. And C.H. Lewis, who was chairman of the Committee on Training of Judges, put together a judging manual, which he published. And I want to thank Clarence Rhodes, who gave me his copy. So I have this manual. It has all the information about the primary elements of judging. Has an extensive selection listing apparently all the roses that were commercially available in their color classes. I would assume that the problem at the time was that we didn't have something like the little publication now that has all the color classes, the handbook for selecting roses, so it was here. And also had an extensive section on distinguishing characteristic varieties. And here you see all the various leaf forms. Well, here's C.H. Lewis's picture. C.H. Lewis was from Salem, Virginia. He had been president of the Roanoke Rose Society, and he served as colonial district director for 2 terms. Shouldn't be confused with C.S. Lewis, who wrote the Chronicles of Narnia. He says C.H. Lewis. The manual also had an application for a rose judging certificate. Apprentice rose judging certificate. And down at the bottom, it says, what judging schools have you attended? And tell us about the rose shows you've judged. So it was apparent that the ARS was trying to get the people who were judging rose shows to apply to be apprentice judges and become accredited ARS judges at the time. Okay, here is a statement in this book that has led to problems, innumerable problems, still causes problems. Is the overall length of the stem should be in proportion to the size of the bloom and must be of sufficient length to show or exhibit 5 or 7 leaflet leaves. The specimen should be severely penalized when exhibited with only 3 leaflet leaves. It's apparent from the context that the requirement for 2, 5, or 7 leaflet leaves was to make sure that you had a stem sufficiently long to balance the bloom in proportion to the bloom. When I first heard all that, I remember going to judging school and hearing this drilled into everyone about you had to have 2 5-leaflet leaves. So why? Nobody seemed to know why, but you did. How can 2 5-leaflet leaves affect affect the beauty of the bloom at the top of the stem. And who has time to count all the leaflets and all the leaves of the specimens you're judging anyway? Well, this was done to make sure that the stem was sufficiently long. All right. Well, there was a problem. C.H. Lewis had the copyright for the book, and he would not permit any changes to be made, any updates to be made. So what the ARS had to do is whenever they changed something or made an update, they published a addendum, and they mailed this addendum to all the members. And so the judges would walk around with the book and all these addendum and more and more addenda. And then when there was a question, they had to go through the book and then go through and make sure who had the most recent addenda to figure out what the answer was. So ARS decided it was time that they had their own judging manual. Don Ballin was was chairman of the Committee on Training and Accrediting Judges, put together the judging manual. Don Ballin was later president from 1986 to 1989. But here's Don in his garden in the Chicago area. That was the picture that appeared on the ARS cover when he was president. So they put out the first ARS judging manual, Guidelines for Judging Roses. And here's what they did. They added one prime element of judging. They added balance and proportion, 10 points. They reduced color by 5 points. They reduced substance by 5 points to get 10 points for balance and proportion. So now we have stem and foliage, 20 points, balance and proportion, 10 points. Stem length is gone. That went out in 1939. These dates are approximate. Well, 1971 isn't, but the other dates are approximate. I've inferred from where I found publications mentioning these scales of judging. I imagine if they still exist in the archives of the American Rose Society, there are probably board meeting minutes that they tell about these, but the dates are all that important. John Corcoran tells me there's a lot of old stuff down there in Shreveport, so maybe if somebody wants to dig through it sometime, they can figure out exactly when these things happen. So now, when they put in balance and proportion, they removed the 5 leaflet leaf requirement. If you go through the original judging manual, there is the only mention of 5 leaflet leaves appears in the section on miniatures, where it says it doesn't matter unless all things are equal, which of course they never are. But in the section on hybrid teas, where you would expect to find the 5 leaflet leaf requirement, there's not a word about it. So the 5 leaflet leaf requirement went out in 1971. If you're still using that requirement, forget it. You're close to 50 years out of date. Unfortunately, there were review materials that went out to judging schools that had review questions. And these questions had been written by somebody who had a 5 leaflet leaf fetish, because every third or fourth question seemed to be about 5 leaflet leaves. And they continued to be used for considerable time. So instructors would still talk about the 5 leaflet leaf, even though nobody knew why that was important. When I discovered all this, I was Penn Jersey chairman of horticultural judges, and I told Jeff Wyckoff, who was the national chairman of judges, you know, somebody ought to get rid of all these out-of-date stuff and replace it and update it. And he said, good idea, why don't you do it? So we do have updated review questions. If you have any old review questions that talk about 5 leaflet leaves, burn them or put them through the paper shredder. They're out of date. All right. I began to exhibit, and I joined the ARS in 19, this is by the way, it's where I came in. We bought a house in 1973, and I put my first roses in 1974. There was a article in the, there was an offer by Star Roses. If you ordered roses from them, you could join the ARS. So we did. So I joined the ARS in July 1974. I began to see about rose shows. And so we started going. And I said, you know, I can do this. And so my first attempt was at a garden club show, actually, the State Garden Club show in the fall. And so I took my roses down early in the morning. I had wonderful hybrid teas. I think I had Pink Peace and Tropicana and maybe some others. And I also had a Starina. So I entered my roses and I asked, where's the small vases? And they said, no, we don't have any. So I put my Starina sort of sitting in the top of a large vase, up where the judges could see it. And as I was leaving, a woman came in with a bucket of the most beautiful roses I had ever seen. And I thought, I need to go back and get all my roses off the table and put them in the trash. And if I can't do that, maybe I should just pull off the entry tags so nobody will know who put them in. Well, I didn't. And I ended up getting several honorable mentions. And lo and behold, a blue ribbon on my Starina. And I was hooked. The woman who had the beautiful roses, Ann Barczewski, she became a good friend and a mentor. Here she is judging at the Delchester Rose Show. And she received the silver medal from the Colonial District in 1981. That was at the National Show in Washington in 1981. We took her down for the banquet. Then I attended my first ARS show was the Delchester Rose Show, which turned out I discovered was in a mall very close to me, just across the line in Pennsylvania. And I signed up to join, and the man at the information desk who signed me up was Lincoln Atkins. Now, I knew who Lincoln Atkins was. He wrote the beginner's column for the American Rose Society magazine, so I'd read a number of his columns. At the time, he was either national or district chairman of horticultural judging. Here's his picture. He's in the middle there with Lee Boyer, Frank Engel, Lincoln Atkins, Lou Gross. This is Nelson Jolly on the far right. And here he is looking at the roses on the right. He's judging with Ben Williams at probably the Delchester show again. Well, Link had worked with Don Ballin on the original ARS judging manual. He, in fact, wrote the introduction to the judging manual, which we've reproduced in the current edition. And he was responsible for the first update, first revision of the guidelines for judging roses, which occurred in 1979. Now, one of the things that he did was to drop the restriction on professionals. The original judging manual had this big long paragraph of a definition of professionals and said professionals couldn't participate. And this probably harkened back to the time when the ARS also had a number of florists and growers who were participating. They had long since lost interest. So this was really a useless section. He dropped it. But what he told me was he got a phone call when he was national chairman of judges from someone, said, we got a real problem. He said, well, that's what we're here for. What's your problem? Well, we have this woman who's very active in our Rose Society, an active exhibitor, and she took a job working for a florist. Now, who knows what her job working for the florist was, whether she ran the cash register or delivered flower arrangements to funeral homes, whatever. But anyway, we determined she was a professional and couldn't exhibit. Well, she doesn't work for the florist anymore, so the real question we're having, and it's a real problem, is how many years does she have to wait before she can start judging again? He said, you know, I told him, if that's the biggest problem you've got where you live, I think I ought to move there. So he decided that that was a useless provision and it's taken out. Interestingly, when I was national chairman of judges, I got a proposed schedule from a local society that was hosting a national show, and that still had the provision in it. And I said, look, that went out in 1979, please remove it. Okay, I began to do some exhibiting, you know, and I learned, you know, how to pick for show. You know, you take a good look at your roses, and decide what looks good, and you cut that and take it to show. Here I am checking out some of my roses before I go to show. And again, showing at the Philadelphia Rose Society Rose Show, which was at the time at Plymouth Meeting Mall. And unfortunately, the mall decided they could make more money. They put a bunch of kiosks in that area instead of rose shows and other flower shows and auto shows and other things like that. So the Philadelphia Rose Society now has their show at Morris Arboretum. But then I went to a district show. Now, this was still the age of the hybrid tea grower, if you want to call it that. To be considered a serious rose grower, you had to grow 200 hybrid teas of all the latest exhibition type, nothing else. You had to spray them at least once a week, and more often when it rained, and exhibit nothing but hybrid teas. So I got the schedule for the district show, and there was a hybrid tea court of honor, had a king, queen, princess, and then there were awards for best white, best yellow, best apricot, best pink blend, best red blend, best mauve, so on and so forth, probably best polka dot someplace down in there. And down at the bottom of the schedule, here were old garden roses, climbers, and shrubs, all classed together under the title Miscellaneous Roses. Well, I won the Miscellaneous Rose Trophy with the rose Marquise Boccello, as you can see from the tag that was on the head table. I didn't, as we tell people in judging school, spelling doesn't count, so I didn't try to correct them. They had my name spelled correctly, and that was probably all that mattered. Anyway, I just won something, so I wasn't going to complain. So I decided about this time that maybe I should find out exactly what judges were looking for. Colonial District was having a judging school in Harpers Ferry, West Virginia in June 1979. So I signed up. I figured, well, it was a Friday night, Saturday with the exam on Sunday, and I figured, well, we'll go down and I'll go to the session on Friday night and Saturday, and Sunday we'll do some sightseeing at Harpers Ferry and come home. So I went down, attended the judging school. Saturday afternoon, Helen Arnold and Alec Martin cornered me and said, "Why aren't you taking the exam?" And I said, well, you know, I just barely meet the qualifications for membership and shows, and Blue Ribbons won. And anyway, I haven't filled out the application, and you have to fill that out well in advance and send it in, pay the fee. And they said, no problem, here's the application form, fill it out. We'll send it in with the exams. So I filled out the application form, paid my fee, took the exam, and passed. So I began my apprentice judging. I had my first apprentice judging that fall at the Penn Jersey District Show in Reading. And the following spring, I judged a show, and I won't tell you where or with whom, but I use this as an example when I talk about judging ethics. I was judging with a prominent judge, and he said to me, "Isn't that rose a little tight for a blue ribbon?" And I didn't argue with him. I said, "Yeah, I think so." So he picked up the vase and blew in the rose. He didn't touch the bloom. He just blew in the rose and put it back down. I said, "Now I think we can give it a blue ribbon." And I asked people in judging school, what should I do? The normal question is reporting to the district chairman of judges, which would have been very easy. He was the district chairman of judges. So not being stupid, and he was the guy who was going to fill out my evaluation, I punched blue ribbon on the tag, and we went on. If I hadn't done that, I might not be here today. Anyway, I continued to exhibit. Here I am exhibiting. The W on the red hat stands for Wabash College, not Wisconsin. On the right there, I've got Irresistible, the best miniature at the Philadelphia Rose Show and some other shows. I also discovered you can win a large bowl, temporary possession of a large bowl. And so I occasionally won a large bowl. I made the mistake of sitting them on the floor, and my dear sweet kitty ran over, jumped in, and curled up and went to sleep. So the bowl on the left was won by someone else the following year, and this exhibitor happened to be hosting the Society's annual picnic. And when we got to the annual picnic, we discovered he was serving punch out of that bowl. We didn't say anything. We assumed he washed it out before he put the punch in, but we avoided the punch. Well, I also continued some judging. Here I am on the left, judging with Craig Dorschel at the Connecticut Rose Society Rose Show. John Mattia took that picture. Don't remember quite where that was, but there I'm teaching at a judging school. And I became chairman of horticultural judging for the Penn Jersey district. And Jeff Wyckoff was national chairman at the time. And Wyckoff was preparing a new revision of the guidelines, and he needed somebody to revise the section on challenge classes and collections. I volunteered. So I revised the section on, and so when the new edition of the guidelines came out, by now they had moved to the loose leaf binder, the familiar red binder, which I'm sure most of you remember. And I got listed as an editor. So here, Louise Coleman and Ed Griffith had revised Atkins's guidelines. Susan Klingham-Peel had written the chapter on mini floras, which of course did not exist at the time the previous edition was published. And I wrote the chapter on, revised the chapter on judging challenge classes collections. So I got listed as an editor. Now, I wanted to emphasize that there are really no, except for the ARS certificates, there are really no standard ARS rules for challenge classes collections. Everyone could be different. And it's what the show schedule says. So I started out, I said, challenge classes and collections are creatures of the show schedule. You won't believe the comments I got about that sentence, but I thought it was something that got people's attention. And so I left it in. All right. So, Wyckoff became president, and I must have impressed him with my revision of the chapter of challenge classes and collections, because he named me national chairman of horticultural judging. It was apparent that a new revision of the guidelines was needed, and the word we got from Shreveport is, we're not going to publish it in this small format anymore. It is extremely expensive to publish in this small format. We have to have it printed, then we have to have it cut, then we have to have it drilled so that they will fit in the binders. And we just can't afford to do that anymore. And anyway, the technology had changed. You didn't have to mail it out to everybody. You could put it on the internet, on the ARS website, and people could download it themselves and print it and put it in there in the binder. So I revised the guidelines. So we had another revision, 2012. We changed the formatting to 8.5 by 11. We paginated each chapter individually. One of the problems with the previous guidelines was that the pages were numbered sequentially through the entire volume. So if the pagination of one chapter changed, it changed the pagination of the whole book. So here, each chapter was paginated individually, so you could replace one chapter and not affect the pagination of the rest of the book. And that obviously made it less expensive to update, and you could download and print copies from the ARS website. Also, formerly the there was one chapter that covered shrubs and old garden roses. And these were divided into 2 chapters. And when that was done, it became apparent that the judging of shrubs is very similar to the judging of climbers, not the old garden roses. And that's not surprising. Shrubs and climbers are both classifications, both based on growth habit, not flower form. And blooms with one, or specimens with one bloom, with or without side buds, compete with sprays for awards in both the shrub and climber classes. Formerly, shrubs could be shown stem on stem and climbers couldn't, but that has been changed. So there's essentially no difference between the judging of shrubs and the judging of climbers. You can almost say that climbers are merely shrubs with extra long canes. So anyway, old garden roses also became a separate chapter. Now, where are we now? Well, it's apparent that a new revision of the guidelines will be needed by 2021. In Nashville, the board made major changes to the rules of disqualification and penalization. A revised chapter on disqualification and penalization was written, was considered by the board at the meeting on Thursday. Changes for the shrub classification had been proposed, were also considered by the board at the meeting on Thursday. Prizes and Awards Committee is reviewing the National Challenge classes and may have changes to them too. I hope to have this all done by the fall meeting in Milwaukee in 2021. That's when my term ends. I don't want to leave a lot of loose ends lying around for my successor to take care of. So we hope to have a new edition of the guidelines for the fall of 2021. All right. This slide is a slide I put together for a talk I gave to garden club judges several years ago. And as you can see, it's for showing faults, form faults in judging. There's creases in the center of the double delight, which is not unexpected. There's a rose that's too tight, another rose that has a crease in the center. Now, I didn't take these pictures. What I did, I told my internet browser, show me a bunch of pictures of rose blooms, and it did. Showed me dozens, and I went through and picked these out. And so these are pictures that somebody, I don't know who, somebody for some reason had posted on the internet. I don't know why they posted them, but I don't think they posted them because they wanted to show form faults in rose judging. Most likely they said, look at the beautiful rose I grew. I'm proud of it. And they are beautiful roses. Don't let the fact that you know about form, substance, color, size, so on, spoil your appreciation of the roses. No rose is perfect. Enjoy them all. So here we see the Jasper Crane Rose Garden in Wilmington, Delaware. Peggy Martin on the arbor. And here's some of the roses in bloom. Enjoy the roses. And stop and smell the roses. I know sometimes it's not convenient to stop and smell the roses, but when you can, remember to stop and smell the roses. Thank you. Questions?